thanks to everybody for joining us. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Krashen. He is Professor of Education at the University of Southern California and is an influential theoretician and scholar in the field of second language acquisition. He received a PhD in linguistics from the University of California in 1972. Since then, he has contributed widely to the fields of second language acquisition, bilingual education, and reading. For those of us teaching English as a second language for the British Council, his work has directly impacted ours. Most of you will be aware of his input hypothesis, his monitor hypothesis, the term the effective filter, among his other work. More recently, Dr. Krashen promotes the use of free voluntary reading to help learners in their language learning. Without further ado, may I present to you Dr. Stephen Krashen.
Well, my only comment on your wonderful introduction, when you said recently he's been working on reading, actually that's been 30 years now, man. Wow, I still think that's the big one. That's been the major breakthrough. And I am indebted in the research there to the work in first language, which is, of course, Frank Smith and Kenneth Goodman, who passed away last week. A real loss, a major hero. Okay, I'm ready to go. Shall I begin?
Sure, the floor is yours.
Okay, do people have access to the handout that I sent?
I believe they do, yes.
Okay, good, because I do, but I lost it. So I'm going to try to remember what was on it. And my printer is not working today. So here we go. All this begins with the acquisition learning distinction, which happened in 1975. An idea that I thought was original with me, but turned out wasn't. A lot of people had come to the same conclusion, which is, of course, very, very gratifying. And this says we have two ways of getting better in language and two ways of getting better in literacy, developing literacy. You can acquire language, you can learn language, and they're very different. Acquisition we sometimes call the natural way, and it's subconscious, and that means two things. It means, first of all, while it's happening, you don't know it's happening. You think something else is happening. You think you're having a conversation, reading a book. Of course you are, but at the same time, you might be acquiring. Second, once you're finished acquiring, you're not always aware that anything has happened. It's represented subconsciously in your brain. I'll give you an example of this. What happens to you when you hear someone make a mistake in a language you know very well, your first language or a language you know very well? Can you always tell what rule was broken? You're saying, no, of course I can tell. I can't either. I can tell you most of the time, I think about 90, 95% of the time, I can tell you pretty well what rule was broken. But about 5-10% of the time, I have a feeling that something was wrong, but I can't quite put my finger on it. That's acquisition. That's what we're talking about. By the way, just so you won't feel bad, you can't tell every time what rule is broken. I have a PhD in grammar, if you can imagine that, and I can't always tell. We think the ability to acquire language, what we call pick up language without realizing it, is with us our entire lives. It never goes away. Children acquire first language, teenagers acquire language, grown-ups acquire language, and I'm discovering that old people acquire language. I'm still doing it. My pal, Steve Kaufman, a really adept polyglot, speaks like 15, 16, 17 languages, and I've heard him speak several of them, and he's really, really good. He acquired 8 of them after age 62. I think that is really encouraging. Okay, that's one process, acquisition. It is powerful. It's something the brain does very well. We're very good at acquisition. We're not very good at the other process. The other process is learning. Learning means consciously knowing about language, knowing the rules, being able to describe them, etc. Learning, of course, is the foundation of modern pedagogy, unfortunately, and it's what we did in school. When we talk about rules, when we talk about grammar, we're typically talking about conscious knowledge of language. The idea is that error correction helps learning. You make a mistake, someone corrects you, you're supposed to think of the rule and make a change, okay? The brain is not very good at conscious learning. My impression is that most people, in fact, many professionals, think learning is the only game in town. It's the only way to do it. And this has been a tragedy, in my opinion. We're trying to build awareness that acquisition happens, that it's very strong. Second result of our research, and this is largely the result of studies we did in the late 1970s and early 1980s. We call this the natural order hypothesis. And it says we acquire the rules of language, not learn, but acquire the rules of language in a predictable order. Some things come early, some things come kind of in the middle, some things come late. Give you some examples. These examples happen to work for both English as a first language and English as a second language. It's not always that clear, but these are good examples. The ing marker, John is playing the violin. It means what's going on now or what will happen in the near future. What are you doing next week? Well, I'm going to Canada, whatever. That's an early one. It's one of the first grammatical markers to come in first and second. A late one, good example, the late one is the third person singular. I go, you go, he goes. In first language acquisition, there could be 6 months to a year between those two. In second language, the third person singular may never come. We all know people who speak English as a second language very well and don't always get the third person singular, even if they know the rules quite well. 3 amazing facts about the natural, I'm going to be full of amazing facts today. The 3 amazing facts about the natural order. Number 1, you can't change it. It's there. You can drill the third person singular all day long, but it will not be acquired until the time has come, just like good wine. It isn't a question of easy rules followed by complicated rules. A lot of items that seem very simple to linguists that we can describe easily are very late acquired. And a lot of things that seem complicated are early acquired. You already see the problem. Our syllabi go from simple to complex, but that's not the syllabus in the mind of the language acquirer. The next one we call the monitor hypothesis, and this one has been very helpful. It says that learning, consciously learned language, is hard to use. I'm not opposed to grammar teaching. I'm sometimes quoted as saying, don't ever teach grammar. Grammar is evil, grammar is wrong. Teach grammar, go to jail. No, my conclusion is it's very limited. And the monitor hypothesis makes this explicit. First of all, if you want to apply rules when you're speaking, when you pause, you think of the rule and apply it, you got to know the rule, and that's very hard. Number 1, professional linguists, the Noam Chomskys of the world, will freely tell you they don't know all the rules of language. They haven't described them all. The best grammarians, the ones who write books about grammar, they don't know all the rules. They know fewer rules than Chomsky does. They know a lot. They don't know them all, though. The best grammar teachers, the most dedicated grammar teachers, don't teach all the rules they know. They don't teach all the rules in the book. And our best, most dedicated grammar students don't understand all the rules that we teach them. So this is a severe constraint on how much grammar you can actually learn and use. That's just number 1. You got to know the rule. Number 2, if you want to apply rules while you're writing or speaking, you got to be thinking about correctness. You got to be what we call focused on form. This is kind of unnatural. It's kind of like thinking about rules and grammar while you're speaking and even writing is kind of like patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. It's hard to do. Our tendency as human beings, when we're having a conversation, is to focus on what the other person is saying and on what we're telling them, not on grammatical correctness. Third, you got to have time to do it. Normal conversation, there isn't a lot of time to drag up, retrieve the rules, think about them, put them in the right place, etc. So all three of these conditions have to be met. I have the impression that the grammarians of the world, and they're okay, some of them are friends of mine, but some of them think that the reason we are here on Earth in this incarnation is to master the rules of language and apply them correctly and get everything right all the time, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. No, the conditions are rarely met. The only time all three of these conditions are met, when you know the rule, when you've studied it, you're thinking about the rules and you have time, is when you take a grammar test. And our studies done back in the 70s and 80s show that's what we see. People don't think about rules unless we really force them to. When we give them a grammar test, you take a grammar test, you study the rule, you're thinking about rules, and you have time to apply it. Anything short of that, we don't use grammar very much, hardly at all. So this is what the monitor does. This is why we call it the monitor hypothesis. The monitors is conscious rules that we can apply while we're writing, while we're speaking, and it's very, very hard to do. It's not useless, though. Sometimes it helps. Even for native speakers, people like me and many of you, there are some rules of English that I don't quite get right, that I have to look up, where my personal idea of the rule is different from the accepted form. My favorite example is its and its. It's it apostrophe s, its. This is a rule I think that's disappearing from the language or in the middle of language change. And if I want to get it right, I got to look it up because I forget what the right form is. So this is happening. It happens to everyone. And these are the rules of usage that we teach kids in school. Next hypothesis is the big one. Today I'm calling it the comprehension hypothesis. I've called it the input hypothesis. This is the big one. We acquire language in one way when we understand it. When we understand what people tell us, when we understand what we read. And it happens subconsciously. The process is subconscious. Two more in my forever lists of amazing facts. Number one, acquisition of language through comprehension is effortless. It takes no energy, takes no work. It just happens. Number two, it's involuntary. If you get what we call comprehensible input, you acquire whether you want to or not. Wow. Language acquisition is easy. All you have to do is listen to people tell you things you're interested in hearing, read things you're interested in reading, focus on the message, and language acquisition happens. It doesn't take grim determination and hard work. An important corollary, talking is not practicing. If you want to be a fluent speaker, that doesn't mean talk more, talk more, talk more. It means listen more, read more, and it will come. Writing is also not how we get better in writing. Writing has other virtues, but it's not the path to language acquisition. The ability to speak fluently and accurately, the ability to write accurately, is the result of getting comprehensible input. Again, I'm just stating these outrageous hypotheses. The evidence for this is in my books and papers, and the good news is that you can access all of these for free. They are all on my website, or as many as I can put on, which is sdkrashen.com. I no longer publish in professional journals because they're too expensive. I publish in open access journals. They're still professional. They're a lot easier to work with. And I don't write books anymore because nobody can afford them. But if you want to see the data, it is there. The final hypothesis is the affective filter hypothesis. This is really an idea from my colleague Heidi Dulay and Marina Burt back in the 1970s when we taught a course together. What it says is that affective variables like anxiety, motivation, all that, don't directly influence language acquisition. What they do, if you're anxious, if you're not motivated, etc., the affective filter is a block that keeps the input from penetrating the language acquisition device. It's outside language acquisition. This is a very useful hypothesis. In other words, being nervous, not focusing, being bored, that doesn't change the order of acquisition. It just prevents you from getting the input into the language acquisition device. Now, a while ago, Leonard Newmark pointed out that if you want people to acquire language, you've got to first make sure they pay attention to the language. They pay attention to the input. And he pointed out the easiest way of doing that is make sure the input is interesting. How about that? Well, I think that's true. I think it's a profound insight. It seems obvious now. And I want to push it a little bit farther. I suspect interesting is, if you want ideal, optimal language acquisition, you want more than interesting. You want very interesting. The word I like is compelling. You want the input to be so interesting that you temporarily forget, in a sense, that you're listening to or reading a second language. You're in what Csikszentmihalyi calls a state of flow. I recommend his book. It's really good. Where your sense of self temporarily disappears because you're involved in the activity. Your sense of time disappears. It's just you and the activity. So Csikszentmihalyi and his colleagues have looked at mountain climbers in Italy, motorcycle riders in downtown Tokyo, and they say when they're doing these things, the world disappears around them. Only the activity counts. The sense of time disappears, the sense of self is diminished. That's what we want to happen for language acquisition. I want to give you a case history, which I've learned a great deal from. It was presented to me by my former student, Christy Lau. And as you see in the handout, she and I did a paper, which you can easily access. This is about her son. We call him Paul. In the article, his real name is Vincent. And Vincent's now getting ready for grad school, etc. Very nice young man. Anyway, when Vincent was a little boy, the family lived in the Bay Area in San Francisco. Mom and Dad, Christy and her husband, were both speakers of Cantonese, coming from the Hong Kong area. And Cantonese was the language of the home. Mom and Dad lived with them, so everyone spoke Cantonese. And Paul grew up comfortable with Cantonese and English. When he was school age, Mom and Dad had to temporarily, and younger, in fact, started right away, had to sometimes hire a babysitter because of their work pressures. They got a very nice lady who spoke Mandarin, and she turned on the TV to Mandarin cartoons. Now, you know, and I know that Mandarin and Cantonese are not the same language. Cantonese is not a dialect of Chinese, it's a separate language. If you speak Mandarin, you'll have a little head start toward if you speak Cantonese, it'll help you a little bit with Mandarin. There's similar vocabulary, they're related, but you won't be a Mandarin speaker. You'll be a Cantonese speaker. Well, the babysitter turned on the TV to Mandarin cartoons, and Vincent, Paul, would start watching them. I am a big admirer of children's TV. I think it's amazing. And he got really hypnotized by the cartoons on television. Now, he was helped in his comprehension because he had Cantonese vocabulary, and the visuals of the cartoon helped a lot. And the stories were so good. Those of you who watch SpongeBob know what I mean. They're really very well done. And also the friendly babysitter would help out. After a while, he started to understand the cartoons, would watch the same ones again and again. When he got older, he started watching Mandarin TV, which you can get in San Francisco, and watch programs for children. When he was in high school, Dad would bring home 2 movies every weekend in Mandarin. The whole family would watch. And the whole family got together in the evenings and watched the news on TV in Mandarin. Today, Vincent speaks Mandarin based on this input. That was his major source. Christy Lau has told me when they have friends over and the friends are Mandarin speakers, guests, Vincent does absolutely fine, no problem. The family has traveled to Taiwan, to Beijing, Mandarin speaking areas. Vincent's quite comfortable. Here's the big point. At no time was Vincent motivated to acquire Mandarin. The Chinese government, the Beijing government, is very interested in all Chinese people, no matter what their origin, everyone should know Mandarin, the language that binds us together. So there's a big effort to get everyone to know some Mandarin. Vincent didn't care about that. He had no motivation to learn Mandarin. He didn't care one way or the other. He liked the cartoons. He liked the programs. He liked the stories. So this changes our whole idea of motivation. You know, I want to learn this language, or your teacher telling you how important it is. It'll be good for you later on. Much more powerful. Tell your students stories, good stories that they really want to hear, and they'll acquire the language whether they're motivated or not. I want to make a couple more comments about language acquisition before we get into the application. And on the handout, on the notes, it says language acquisition is gradual. Big one. You don't get things all at once. In our classes, we expect students to master new vocabulary and new grammar, sort of the moment it's presented, the moment it's taught. You know, you get the idea of the rule, you practice a little, and you should know it. It's not how acquisition works. Studies from United Kingdom have shown that each time you see a word, sorry, this is wrong citation. Studies from the University of Illinois, Richard Anderson and his team. Each time, I've only had one cup of coffee this morning, it's early morning here. Each time you see a word in print, and the print helps make it comprehensible, a comprehensible context, and it's new to me, you don't get the whole thing, you get a little piece of it. You get about 5–10% each time you see a new word in a comprehensible context. That may not seem like very much, but if you hear enough of the language and if you read enough, that's more than enough. Richard Anderson and his team have estimated that, 12-year-olds in the UK and London, middle-class kids, read about 1 million words a year in their first language. Just getting 5% of the meaning of the word each time you see it will result in vocabulary growth of several thousand words a year. This is the only way it can happen. We know huge numbers of words. Frank Smith has used this example. Let's say the average native speaker knows 50,000, 100,000 words. That's not 50,000, 100,000 trips to the dictionary. It can't be done that way. We gradually absorb it in context. Now, context has been attacked. Some experts don't believe in context. They say we don't always know that context is giving us the right answer. A favorite example, if the reader sees a picture of a man pointing with his hand, you don't, and there's a new vocabulary word, you don't know from the picture if that means pointing, hand, or finger. So context doesn't give you everything, and sometimes it can be misdirective. It can point you in the wrong direction. Well, I listed one study that showed this, others showed the same thing. Contexts are not misdirective in general. In general, they do give you some help, and it's kind of rare when they push you in the wrong direction. I think context is how it happens. Let me move now to application. How I think this is, it's being applied now in various places. I'll tell you about them. And let me come up with a new hypothesis. It's good for my career, a new hypothesis every 10 minutes, or like every 10 months. This one we call the Conduit Hypothesis. And I'll tell you what it means. It means we go through predictable stages in moving from the lowest levels of language competence all the way to the highest levels. First language and second language go through these stages. They're universals. Stage 1 for everybody stories. For sure, this is true in first language development. Kids hear lots and lots of stories. The parents tell them stories, the teachers tell them stories, they see stories on the media, etc. And this is the basis of their beginning language competence. Studies confirm this. Kids who hear more stories in school, at home, do better in school, do better in absolutely everything. This is how they get vocabulary. This is how they get grammar. This is how they get what we call text structures, how stories are put together. And this is how they get knowledge of the world. I'll give you only one case history. There's a lot out there in the literature. You can look them up. This is the one I know best, and it's me. It applies to me, and people like me. When I tell you about how I became literate in English, I would love to tell you a story of my heroic adventures, how I overcame obstacles and nevertheless succeeded despite the odds against me. Well, that wasn't true. I had a really easy time. My theory is, my hypothesis is, you know, that when you're reincarnated into the next life, just before you jump into the next life, there's a committee meeting, and you're there with your spirit guides and the people you've reincarnated with over and over again. I don't remember the meeting, but I have a pretty good idea what happened. My hunch is my previous lives were very difficult before this one. And my spirit guides and people I had reincarnated with decided to give me a vacation. And they made this one really easy, which it has been. I grew up middle class, eventually upper middle class, comfortable, with nearly the complete absence of family problems. Mom and Dad were wonderful. They loved me. They loved my sister. We had a great time. We had books in the home. We had food. Dad was what we call an ethical capitalist, a businessman who cared about other people and tried to give people a fair deal all the time. Very influenced by him, I hope. So I had stories everywhere. Mom and Dad told me stories. My sister told me stories. My sister got me a library card, access to the local library when I was 9 years old, okay? This is the kind of advantage I had everywhere. So I couldn't miss. I did fine in school, did okay, because I had so much literacy and so much background knowledge. So did all my friends, by the way. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood. I think it's important that people who had these advantages recognize it. Recognize the huge advantage of being middle class. If I didn't have these advantages, I don't know how I would have made it. Even with the advantages, school was not all that easy. High school, secondary school, I had to work hard. University was difficult. I didn't do all that well. Without these advantages, it would have been absolutely hopeless. Second language, we have discovered stories. The field of second language has embraced stories. The TPRS method, teaching English through, teaching English through stories and reading, has embraced stories. And a method developed by my colleague, Beniko Mason in Japan, called story listening, is based on this. And I think that she has made tremendous progress with this. Her method of beginning language teaching, and you should check her out by the references I've supplied, benikomason.net, storylistening.org, and her many, many papers. She has applied this in Japan for English as a foreign language, and other people have applied this all over the world, second language, etc. The first stage, the teacher tells stories. Stories that are of universal interest. She likes to use fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm, other sources like that. She makes the stories comprehensible in several ways. Her primary way is drawing. She tells the story, and as she's telling the story, she's drawing pictures to describe the characters, you know, the house, the forest, etc. If she knows the first language of the students, there's occasional translation. and the use of gestures. And she uses stories that are amenable, that fit very well with this approach. When the new vocabulary is explained like this, it's actually made comprehensible. The story's made comprehensible. Big important point. We don't expect students to master the new words. We expect the explanation to help the students understand the story. Big point coming up. When you do that, you get more vocabulary acquisition. You make the story more comprehensible, and vocabulary acquisition comes as a consequence. Let me direct your attention to a table on the handout, which was one of the first studies we did with this. I co-authored it with Benico. My way of working really works for me. It's a brilliant technique. I work with colleagues. They do the work. I help them write it up, and I get most of the credit. It works fabulous. Okay, let's get serious. Study Benico did, but I got some of the credit, did some of the statistics. One group heard a story that she presented with pictures and occasional translation. In the chart, that's story only. She gave them pre-test, and she gave them a post-test on the words that she had explained 5 weeks later. And the students were not told there was a post-test. The average was nearly 4 words gained, 3.8 words that were remembered 5 weeks later. A second group did story, but extra study. She not only did the story, but it was followed by exercises to help them master the vocabulary, to help them internalize the rules, internalize the words, etc. This is the normal way of doing it. When you get storybooks in other languages, and I have several, there's the story, and afterwards, there's exercises on the new vocabulary. Draw a line from the word to the definition, etc. Choose the right meaning, etc. Well, that group gained more. Look at that in the chart. The story-only group gained only 3.8 words. Story plus study gained nearly 11.5. Well, that shows that all those exercises and conscious learning is a good idea. No, it actually shows the opposite. Look at the next column, how long it took. The story-only group, the whole thing took 15 minutes. If you add the exercises, it was 70 minutes. Benico did a very interesting calculation. She calculated how many words were gained per minute, counting the story and story plus study. Story only was much more efficient. They gained 0.25 words per minute with just the story. Adding study lowered efficiency considerably. Conclusion: forget the exercises. Tell another story. You'll like it better. The students will like it better. And there's more permanent acquisition of vocabulary. Grammar rules, exercises, fill in the blanks are not an efficient use of time. Not only that, they're not as pleasant, not even close. Well, that's the story time. Story, we like the first stage, not only gives you language, but it acts as a conduit to the next stage, which is why we call this the Conduit Hypothesis. The next stage is the big one, reading. This has been my obsession now for 30 years. The power of reading, the power of compelling, interesting reading when you get lost in the book. My conclusion in first language and second language, that reading for pleasure, reading because you want to, is the major source of our vocabulary, our grammar, grammatical accuracy, our ability to write with an acceptable writing style, spelling. Reading won't make you a perfect speller, but it'll make you a pretty good speller. Not only that, reading is the source of a great deal of our knowledge of science, history, practical knowledge, and positive habits of mind. We'll get back to those. I'm going to give you just a touch of the evidence on each point. Reading gives you language. This is a study done with Beniko Mason, of course, and it's one I'm very excited about. In Japan and other Asian countries, they suffer from a disease called Toeic Fever. Toeic is this standardized test of English that everybody takes. It's popular in Korea, it's popular in Japan, popular in Taiwan. It's actually a fairly valid test, it's not bad. Reading comprehension and listening. When Beniko was teaching at her university, she retired last year in Japan, in the Kobe area. She would give a course, I think she's still doing it, even though she's retired, and the course was open to anybody who wanted to come in, people who wanted to improve their English. The course classes was story, and the homework was reading. Each time she taught it, a few students asked her if they could continue working with her, if she would help them so they could do a reading program on their own. She agreed under the condition that they take pre and post tests of the Toeic. Let me give you the results of these students. She had a group of students, I think about 8 of them, which we analyzed. She had their notes on what they read and how long they did it. The ages of these students range from 26, I think, to someone in his 70s, nearly as old as I am. Oh my gosh, very good evidence. The language acquisition device never shuts off, still there. She asked them to take the Toeic, and she correlated that with the amount of time they put in reading. They went anywhere from a few weeks to over a year. Here are the results. For every hour of reading, you gain slightly more than a half a point on the Toeic test. And it was pretty stable with all our subjects. And they read different things. Generally, they read young people's literature. They read, one guy read Harlequin romances. That was quite interesting. They read graded readers. They read all kinds of things. They read, Twilight, all kinds of stuff. The results were pretty stable. They gained about a half a point, a little more for every hour they read. And this predicts if you read, let's say, 3 hours a day for a year, or an hour a day for 3 years, you'll go all the way from the lowest level of the Toeic all the way up to very, very high levels of competence. So take your choice. You can take a preparation class and study the grammar rules, or you can sit down, have a nice cup of coffee, and read a good book. I'll take the second way. Okay, this is one study. Let me tell you about another one. This was done in London, University of London. The University of London has a research team of people who've been studying the same subjects for over 40 years. They did studies on them when they were babies, very small, when they were teenagers, and now adults. The most recent study they did when these people were 43 years old. They gave them a vocabulary test and questionnaires. The best predictor of vocabulary in your first language is reading, and the kind of reading that counted the most, fiction. Isn't that interesting? We're going to see fiction coming back to us with the next category. Keith Stanovich is a very good researcher at University of Michigan, and he's done a series of studies looking at people who read a lot, basically fiction readers. The more you read, the more you know. The more you know about history, the more you know about literature, the more you know about science. Fiction is our major source of knowledge about the world, and the more you know about practical things. Wow. The most recent good news about reading, I read this in an article originally in Scientific American, then I looked up all the sources. People who read more, especially fiction, have more sophisticated, what we call habits of mind. People who read more fiction don't rush to conclusions. They have what they call a greater tolerance for vagueness. They have more of an open mind. They understand other people better. They don't, they're less prejudiced, etc. I understand this because when you're reading fiction, you take the role of the protagonist. You go through the protagonist and you try to solve the same problems the protagonist tries to solve. which if you read hundreds of books, as all of you have lived many lives. You've had all these adventures, which I think contributes to a more open mind. Well, how do we do this? After we go through the read aloud stage, the stories, we enter the stage of pleasure reading. Self-selected reading is the goal. If you want reading to be compelling, self-selected helps make sure this happens. We begin the stage not with full self-selected reading, but a modified stage. This is also developed by Benico Mason, called guided self-selected reading. This is a very good idea. I call it stage 2A, where the students, including when they're still in the story stage, start reading easy books that are assembled for them by the teacher, because these are kind of hard to find. You make them as interesting as possible, and they read these books and go on and read more. These are, as we see here, well-written, truly compelling, comprehensible stories for beginners, not available ever in the real world. I remember, just like you, I took language in school. I took French in high school. Oh my. I got a passing grade after 4 semesters under the condition that I never study French again in that school, because the teacher didn't want to fail me. He wanted to give me a passing grade so he wouldn't ruin my record. I owe this guy, let me tell you, because he didn't want to, be blamed for my poor French. By the way, my French now is not so bad, and it comes basically through reading. The languages I'm pretty good in, I've had a lot of easy reading, lots of it in French. I'm doing it now in Spanish and German, etc. It's hard to find in regular language classes. The French class I took, the first chapter of the French book, and the first several chapters were all these boring stories about people I didn't care about, Monsieur et Madame Dupont and their strange children and what they did. It was all designed to practice the vocabulary and the new grammar rules. After you did that, you immediately jumped to what we call authentic texts, classics, nonfiction, etc. So no wonder people don't do well in these classes. Instead, you begin with easy reading. Benico Mason's students go through the easy reading stage for several years. Wow. Sometimes 2-3 years. They start with these carefully selected texts, move on to what we call graded readers. You've seen them, the Oxford series, the Newbery series, etc. Her students at her university had access to a library of 5,000 graded readers. Now you're talking. This is what it takes. Then after going through this, lots and lots, they gradually move on to really true, authentic reading. I think this is what we need to move toward. I am doing this now in Spanish. I think it's very good for researchers like me to always be working with a language, 2-3 languages, whatever, and go through the same process. In Spanish, I'm just about to this stage where I can read nearly anything, but the graded readers are still helpful. Last summer, I managed to get through Isabel Allende's book, Zorro, The Authentic, which was so compelling. It was easy to just keep plunging on because the story was so well written. I'm still reading graded readers, and they're expensive. That's the problem. I would like them to be supplied by libraries, but this is the key. And I'm still improving even after several years of reading these things. Then we go on to authentic books, and we can read on our own. That's the job of the real world. School, Benico says, I agree, the job of school is to give you stories, guided self-selected reading, and bring you to the point where so-called authentic texts were books written by native speakers for native speakers are now possible. This is what I think should happen. Once you reach that stage, reading will solve your problems. Everything you need, in fact, I'm more and more impressed with reading all the time. If we really make reading possible, our job of education is so much easier. Jeff McQuillan quoted the studies in one of his wonderful paper. If you read 1 million words of science fiction, you will encounter a huge percentage of the technical scientific vocabulary that underlies most disciplines. I'll tell you about my current study. My current study has to do with my cousin Evelyn. Got to tell you about Evelyn. Evelyn's quite a bit older than I am, but when I was growing up, she was my mom's best friend. The niece-aunt relationship was very close. And I really have warm feelings about Evelyn. She's in her 90s now. And she made this startling declaration that she wanted to go take classes in law, find about legal aspects. Her late husband, among other things, had a law degree. And Evelyn was always very, very impressed with how much he knew in general, law, etc. So I told her, read some novels. Read the novels of John Grisham, who wrote these novels about law. I said, Evelyn, you read 10 of these, it's like a year of law school. She's reading them now, and she is agreeing with me. She says, the stories are wonderful, and I'm discovering so much about the legal world. I'm getting technical vocabulary. I know how they do it. I know how people are sued. I know how, so this is quite true. And it's the free voluntary reading that she's doing on her own. We've been engaged in a problem where this is very, very obvious. The lack of easy reading. The problem of heritage language acquisition. My colleague, Nushan Ashtari, and I have been working on this. We've been looking at heritage language development. Heritage language, here's what happens. You're, say, born in, say, an English-speaking country, and the family language is not the same as the language of the country. Your home language, the United States, it's Spanish. Farsi is one of them, the language of Iran, so-called Persian, other languages. And kids don't always develop that language. They grow up only with the language of the country, or they're very, very limited. It's a good idea to be bilingual. It's a good idea to acquire the heritage language as well as the language of the country. There are no disadvantages, only advantages. People who master the language of their parents and grandparents have better communication with the older generation, which means they have access to all the wisdom of the family. They have better communication to the literature of the home language. Spanish, very rich. Farsi, my gosh, very rich literature. Not accessible unless you can read and understand the language. Well, we got interested in this because of some studies done by my former students. The big one was a study done by Lucy Say, TSC. She looked at children who grew up in families in the United States that spoke Korean, that spoke various Chinese languages, that spoke Japanese. She found the ones who mastered the home language, even though they lived in the United States the whole time, were readers. They read light reading, they read heavy reading, they read comic books, they read magazines, etc. They are the ones who were native-like in both languages. So we want people to have access to both. The tragedy with Farsi right now, Dr. Ashtari has looked at libraries, has looked at bookstores, and it's hard to find things that are interesting. This is a problem we can solve easily by providing good literature. So this, I think, underlies is a solution that's going to make life a lot easier and more rich for a lot of people. In summary, it's comprehensible input that counts, understanding, and the powerful way of getting it is through reading, and reading that you decide you want to read. For this to happen, the books have to be there. Access is the big problem. Making sure our public libraries and school libraries are filled with all kinds of books in the primary language of the country, the foreign languages, the home languages, etc. And this can be done for a modest financial investment. We cheerfully invest millions in useless software, useless computer equipment, most of which doesn't work at all, has not even been tested, or programs guaranteed to help you, Rosetta Stone, et cetera, which turned out is not that impressive when you look at the research. And we're very reluctant to do the obvious. Make sure books are there that they can read. I want to end this session with a confession. I've been very interested in the huge influence of conscious learning in our lives and how hard it is to overcome it. I'll tell you what happened to me recently, and I'm sure this has happened to some of you. I was reading 2 different books in Spanish, books designed for people wanting to improve their Spanish students. One of them was pretty challenging. It was written by a colleague of mine whose work in theory I greatly respect, Bill Van Patten. And the book was difficult, but it was good. It was really good. It was about a brother-sister relationship and how loyal they were, the sister and brother, and how the sister helped in explaining to the parent what was going on with the brother, etc. Very, very moving book. I really enjoyed it. There was no dictionary in the back. Remember that. I was also reading another book that was much, much easier. In fact, I knew most of the words. After every chapter was a dictionary. I couldn't help it. I looked up every single word because I could, because the dictionary was right there. 98% of the time, I didn't have to. I didn't trust acquisition. Let me make sure. In other words, I gave in to the undertow, the pulling me toward conscious learning. Now, look, undertow is a term invented or applied by Alfie Kohn, how we do in pedagogy in general. The traditional way is a hard pull on us. It's very hard to resist. I am personally largely responsible for the emphasis on acquisition. I'm largely responsible for the push toward gaining vocabulary through reading and not studying vocabulary words. And even I gave in to this temptation. It's still very, very hard to resist. So I wanted to be certain, make sure I knew it. No, I should have remembered language acquisition is gradual. If I understood the text, I'm doing everything I need toward eventually acquiring this vocabulary. So don't feel guilty when it happens to you. It's very powerful. Also, more confession of regression. The reason I went into language teaching and linguistics, here's my confession. I love grammar. I can't help it. The work of Chomsky, I still think, is absolutely beautiful. It's gorgeous. It's elegant. It's wonderful. When I see a rule of grammar, I am amazed at the beauty of the description. And my confession is, when I learn a rule consciously and I apply it, I rekindle the joy of having mastered it. French is great for this. In French, there's this delicious rule that's very late acquired that says if you have a direct object and it's a pronoun and it comes before the past participle, you make it agree. You don't say la chose que j'ai pris, you say la chose que j'ai prise. That's very late acquired. I have not acquired it. I've learned it consciously. Every time I make the direct object pronoun agree, I rekindle the victory. I feel so proud of myself. I get pleasure from it. What I have to understand, though, normal people get their pleasures elsewhere. This is not normal. My pal, Steve Sternfeld, former student of mine, says when he manages to apply a rule like that in the old days, he felt when people hear him do it, they should applaud. Okay, this is people like us who think grammar is so beautiful. I have to overcome this. I have to not worry about it. I did overcome it last summer. I'll tell you what happened. In Spanish, as I told you, I am an intermediate. I'm okay in conversation. I can read a lot and understand it. And casual stuff, I'm fine. But late acquired rules, I may have learned them, but I haven't acquired them. And my favorite example, those who studied Spanish or speak Spanish know all about this, the ser estar distinction, two ways of doing the verb to be. You can't avoid it. It's there everywhere. You can't get every sentence. You're going to have to make a decision if you want to get it right, if you think correctness is important. And until recently, I was hesitant to speak Spanish because I knew I was blowing ser estar. I know the rule. I can tell you all about it, but I haven't acquired it. It doesn't come easily. It doesn't come naturally. If I want to get it right, I have to monitor it. Last summer, I spent a full 10 days in Cuernavaca. I spoke every day at a conference on language teaching. I gave presentations in English, teachers all over Mexico, some from the United States, etc. And I lived with the faculty of the language school. We all had breakfast, lunch, dinner together, and we had great gossip conversations. It was wonderful. Who was it who said, if you don't have anything good to say about someone, sit next to me? I mean, that was actually the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt. And we just gossiped the whole time, charlar, we call it. And I made a deliberate decision in advance. If I'm going to enjoy this, I can't be concerned about ser and estar. I'm just going to let it come out. These are my friends. They were all Spanish teachers. I had a wonderful summer. We gossiped all summer. Nobody corrected me. Nobody cared because we were having such great conversations, and these are friendly people. This is a case where I managed to overcome it. My real point is that the undertow toward conscious learning is extremely powerful. The only way to get over it is through getting compelling, comprehensible input. I am so proud of myself. It is now 2 minutes to go for this talk, so I have fitted exactly into the time, and I will stop here, and we will wait to see if anybody has any questions, okay? So let's take a pause, deep breathing, and I'll have a little bit of secreto del éxito caffeine. Oh my. My first cup of coffee changed my life, let me tell you. It's been downhill ever since. Okay, I'm ready for you.
Caroline Dorr says one word for this, compelling. This comes from Stephanie. How do you get teenagers who haven't acquired a love of reading yet to love reading?
Yes, how do you get people to love reading? One book will do it. Jim Trelease, one of my heroes, the author of a book called The Read Aloud Handbook, which is really wonderful. Oh God, I'll tell you how good it is, okay? I'll tell you how good the Read Aloud Handbook is. My mother was in my office years ago and saw a copy of the Read Aloud Handbook, and she asked if she could borrow it. She brought it back to me, and let me tell you about my relationship with my mother so you'll understand the punchline here. Mom and I had a perfect relationship. Oh my gosh, I am so my mother's son, absolutely. My mom admired my work, thought I was doing very well, admired my writing, all this stuff, couldn't be better. She took the Read Aloud Handbook home, read it, gave it back to me and said, Stephen, why can't you write like this? I said, oh gosh, I wish I could. That's how good it is. So I do recommend that. And in the book, he has a concept, very valuable, called a home run book. There is, in creating readers, sometimes one book is enough. One short story, one story that makes you a reader where you really want to get more. So I would say continue with story listening, etc., and develop a respect for light reading. What made me a reader was comic books. I have tremendous respect for comic books, for Marvel comic books, for Stan Lee, for Spider-Man, all those characters, even Superman, Batman, all that stuff. I still read them, they're still great. I think that's the route to reading for most kids. Extremely light reading that adults sometimes don't have any respect for. The vocabulary level in comics, if you look at the superhero comics, gets really sophisticated after a while. And the easy comics, the ones before that, are pretty good too. So I would go light reading, comic books, make sure it's available. Make sure it's sitting around. I'll bet that 90% of kids who claim they don't want to read would read a good comic book. I would go there.
Thank you.
Great question, thank you.
Andrew Marshall says, Dr. Krashen, do you believe some languages are simply harder to learn than others?
Oh yeah, I think the hard ones, it depends on your first language. The easy ones are where you have cognate vocabulary. The hard ones are where you don't. A hard language means it's not comprehensible. And the biggest burden is when the vocabulary is different. I don't think I deserve a lot of credit for speaking some of the languages I speak, because, you know, come on, French, German, Spanish, the vocabulary, you're already 1/3 of the way there before you start, okay? Hebrew, Amharic, Ethiopian, other languages I've worked on, speak a little bit. Mandarin, a lot different. It's harder to make it comprehensible. There's nothing intrinsically hard about the language. It's the vocabulary load, I think.
Okay, PJB says, I studied you for my master's. You've just made the material come alive. Thank you so much, which is good. Irina Didenko says, if we do not correct the mistakes of the students, how can we avoid their errors becoming fossilized?
Okay, let me go back to the thank you note for making the material come alive. I apologize for what happened in the classes you took. Okay, let's go on. Error correction. The research on error correction is pretty consistent. My favorite author there is a guy named John Truscott, who's American now living in Taiwan, who's done article after article on correction, Truscott. A lot of his papers are available. I would just go on Twitter, Google John Truscott, and his papers will pop up. He's worked at error correction on written, error correction on oral, and he's reviewed the meta-analyses, the collections of papers on error correction. Error correction is an invitation to do conscious learning. You make a mistake, you correct it, you adjust your conscious rule. So you're speaking French and you say, and the French says, no, je suis allé. So you say, oh yeah, that's right. It doesn't work with this auxiliary, it works with the other auxiliary, etc. So that's how we get better, apparently. No, it's subject to all the constraints of conscious love monitoring. In order for it to work, you got to know the rule, you got to understand the correction, you have to have time to apply it. It's very weak. The research does not support error correction. Also, how many times in your life have you been corrected where it's really made a difference? I think it works for those of us who are in love with grammar rules. For normal people, I'll call them normal people, doesn't work. It's input that counts. Language is too complicated to do it one correction at a time. Okay, next.
It's Roy Cross says, I speak French, German, and Croatian reasonably well. I can't write in any of them with any competence. I did a lot of reading and a lot of listening in France, Germany, and Croatia. And I think that listening's important too, he says.
So, I know your name, it's Roy. So Roy, what happens when you try to write? Does nothing come out? My suspicion is that you do have a fair amount of competence if you've read a lot. You make spelling mistakes. You're not sure of the grammar. It's not perfect. It's probably kind of crude, which is what you expect when people are just starting to acquire the language. I would say more reading, and it'll gradually get better. That's my prediction. And you can let me know how it works a year from now when you've done more reading and you've tried more writing. I think you're a better writer than you think.
Okay. Anybody else want to ask any more questions in the chat box? Any more for any more? I think that's it. I think that's it for questions.
Okay, very good.
Yeah. One question's just come up.
Oh, yay.
Ottoman asks, what's your take on reading for a teacher of English who'd like to learn Spanish?
Not easy, my boy. Not easy. The problem is finding stuff to read that's as expensive. We're trying to provide you with material. We're trying in our Danico's website to provide easy stories, lots and lots of them, and for beginners. You have to order them, you have to find them, and that's expensive. What you need is an amazing amount of easy reading that's reasonably interesting. And the only language, in fact, in which that's available is English. And after that, Spanish is improving, but there's still not enough. We're trying to provide it for free. So take a look at the story listening. Storiesfirst.org. We have a section of easy stories. We hope to provide you with more. We hope more of this is going to appear for free on the internet. The problem is financial, basically. But that'll take care of itself eventually.
Miriam asks, how can we explain the fact that some students are stronger in reading and listening, but weaker in terms of speaking and writing?
I don't know. I think what we will find if we did studies of this, that the two performance in the two modalities is highly correlated. The correlation is not perfect, but it is true that the more you read, the better you will understand, the better you'll speak, but it's not one-to-one. My colleague, Kyung-Suk Cho, the correlation was always, those you know statistics, around 0.3, 0.4. The more you read, the better you read, the better you write, the better you speak, the better you're listening, but not perfect, because we don't always, do the same amounts, read and write the same things, etc. But the relationship is there. It's just not 100% exact.
Question, why do schools resist buying books that are interesting to read instead of textbooks for language classrooms?
Oh yeah, boy, that you've just nailed it. That is the problem. The money is there, but we have a powerful lobby. Number one, there's a powerful lobby in the textbook industry, and we have tradition, and there is the undertow. Most people, for number one, most people don't know about this stuff. Even though we've been doing it for 40 years, the research is still unknown except to a handful of people. It's in the domain of researchers and teachers. Even teachers don't know about it because the research is not easily available to them and is expensive and is hard to understand. So number one is getting the ideas around, which is taking time. I hope you'll help me by looking at the stuff we've been posting on the websites, etc. sdkrashen.com. Also, even those of us who understand it feel the powerful undertow of conscious learning. And even I, if I'm not careful, I find it hard to resist. So this is taking a while. Great question. I wish I knew the complete answer.
We got time for one more, maybe?
Sure.
Anwar asks, do you think the medium used for reading has any effect on the learning outcome? He's thinking of ebooks, for example.
Yeah, I just got my first Kindle. My son ordered me to get it, so I did, and it's kind of nice. I like it. I don't think it should make a difference. I think ebooks should be just as powerful as books in print. I know a lot of people have a preference for one or the other, but it is clearly the future, and I think it should have the same impact as paper books that you can hold in your hand. A lot of us old-fashioned people prefer the paper books, I know, but we'll get there. So it shouldn't have an effect.
All right, that is fantastic.
Great questions, you guys. Really good.
All right, okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Krashen, for an hour of your time.
Can I make a request?
Sure.
I'm on Twitter, and my name on Twitter is Krashen. I invite you to follow me on Twitter for several reasons. I use Twitter to largely announce new research results. My papers, but the papers of other people. So if you want to know what's new, follow me on Twitter. Also, I want to include my standing on Twitter and get more followers. It'd be good for my street credibility. I want to catch up to Justin Bieber. So at the rate I'm going, it'll only take me about 2,000 years. So follow me on Twitter and we can, stay connected. You'll see what's new.
I can second that. Can you give us the address once again?
Yeah, I'm just S. Krashen. S as in Stephen.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Dr. Krashen, once again for your time today. It's been
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's wonderful.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody who has, all 74 of you, I've just checked the numbers, who have come and to participate.
Good.
And yes, thank you once again, everybody. Oh, there's lots of thank yous coming from the chat box from a lot of people. Some in Spanish as well.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed.